Hi, here we are with our story again. Evidence not seen. On occasion, the women were allowed to write letters to their husbands. Because Rachel didn't know how to write, she dictated and I acted as her scribe. Her letters conveyed compassionate love for her husband and son. Her concern for the children still with her was obvious. She always ended these missives with 1,000 kisses and hugs. Often, she would share with me a portion of the rice that was left from the bottom of the pot, crispy and browned. It was a treat. Whenever we had finished speaking, Rachel kissed me on both cheeks. A tremendous bond developed between us, enhanced by our mutual devotion to God. Advancing along the left side of the barracks, we came to the beds occupied by Mrs. Muller and her two little ones. Mrs. Muller was very, very small, Eurasian by birth, schooled in Dutch, and she was an altogether dear person. She looked as if a breath of wind could blow her away when she volunteered for work in the garden, and I told her so. She looked as if a breath of wind could blow her away, and when she volunteered for work in the garden, I told her so. She laughed and said, "Oh, but I'm very well, Mevrouw." She was strong and well cared for, and cared well for her two children, who looked like tiny dolls. She must have been very happy in her marriage, and I never ceased to appreciate her optimism and cheerful countenance. Next to her were the 3 Chinese families from Makassar. All of them had been connected with the Chinese embassy. Mrs. Wang Tai Feng was older and worked in the hospital kitchen. Her fine 16-year-old son lived in the house with Dr. Jaffrey. Both Mrs. Lai Tao Howie and Mrs. Yu Pao Heng asked to work with the garden crew. It was an interesting picture to see Mrs. Lai and Mrs. Yu, large hoes over their shoulders, leaving for the fields each morning, followed by their assorted cluster of 5 little girls, all wearing sun hats like their mother. The Lais had been vibrant members of our Chinese church in Makassar. Next came 3 Armenian families. The husbands of all 3 households had been in the import-export business in Makassar and were now incarcerated in the civilians' camp in Pari-Pari. Sarah, Paul, and her son, Freddie, and her daughter, Dolly, had the block of beds next to Mrs. Wang. While in Molino, Dolly became very ill and the doctor was sent for. His tests proved that her illness was indeed meningitis, as he had suspected. She became paralyzed from the waist down, and even though she recovered from the infection, she went into deep depression. It was not difficult to understand how traumatic it must have been for a pretty young girl like Dolly to find herself paralyzed and see her legs not developing as they should. I found instant rapport with Dolly and tried to see her often. A woman in the next barracks had also had meningitis. However, she had learned to walk again, and with the use of canes. Because their experiences had been similar, she took a vital interest in Dolly, suggested exercises, and encouraged her to believe that she too would recover the use of her legs. The 2 of them worked together as much as possible. With everyone in the barracks leading encouragement, Dolly progressed to the point where she could walk holding onto the ladders of the top sleeping racks. Swinging first one leg, then the other, Dolly moved up and down the length of the barracks. With this remarkable improvement, her depression lifted. A wounded spirit and a broken body began to mend. Freddie, Dolly's junior by 2 years, was very good for her. He never treated her like an invalid. Their occasional disagreements were good therapy. Freddie was tall like their mother, Sarah. When she needed another woman for the garden crew, Sarah volunteered. She had suffered much during her daughter's illness, which would account for her passive, often sad expression. She was not moody. For the moment she was spoken to, her face lit up and she responded. She must have been comforted often by Freddie in her concern for Dolly. There was a strong bond between them. Another family, also named Paul, occupied the next two beds. Lena and her daughter, Vani. Lena's son, Robbie, was housed with the men. For whatever reason, the mother-daughter relationship seemed to have suffered. They needed each other very greatly, but somehow they appeared to have lost the ability to understand and communicate with one another. It was one of the unfortunate consequences of the splitting up of families during the war, made them more regrettable because both Lena and Vonnie were basically nice people. Initially, Lena had been a large woman, but with the passage of time, there was less and less of her. She, like Sarah, worked with the garden crew. Next came Lucy Galstein, daughter Joyce, and son Herbie. Every one of them had lovely, wavy brown hair. The beautiful hair seemed to be characteristic of the Armenians. Lucy was tall, and Joyce was going to be, while Herbie was short, a fact that troubled him not a little. Lucy's mother, Oma Galstone, had the bed next to her. Oma knit white socks for the officers, and Lucy belonged to the garden crew. There were frequent disputations between the two women revolving around how to raise Normie Galstone, the fifth member of the family. He was Oma's grandson and Lucy's nephew. Whatever their recipe, I think the ingredients were correct, for with a full measure of Oma and several dashes of Lucy, Normie turned out to be a tall, garrulous, delightful, slightly bow-legged imp. Normie and Herbie kept things interesting. When Normie ran out of ideas, Herbie pulled a few tricks out of his bag. Then we had another fine Eurasian family of 5 by the name of De Kaiser. There were 2 boys and 2 girls. Jan was the oldest. He was tall and quite thin. Carolina was fairly stocky, built very much like her mother. Both she and the younger sister had long brown hair that was always neatly braided and tied with ribbons. Carolina, who was 17, chose to work at the piggery with others of her age group. Bertie, the younger son, had always a grin and a good word for everyone. He was cooperative and helpful to his family. Mrs. De Kaiser was on the staff at the central kitchen. She was quiet, very proud of her family, and an altogether fine person. The next section of racks was occupied by Oma de Vries, a Eurasian woman married to a Dutchman. Her lovely daughter, Lenny Rapassa, was about 18 years old. Lenny was married with a little daughter, Iris, her second child, and Joyce arrived soon after Lenny came to Campili. It was this young woman who volunteered to nurse the other infant in the barracks. We tried as much as possible to provide her with extra food because of the additional responsibility she had undertaken. Oma suffered from diabetes and appeared to be morose, probably due to her physical unwellness. She was a Christian woman and very faithful in her attendance at devotions. Mrs. Tauerbach had the 4th bed in this section. She was a devout Christian, helped Oma care for Iris, and, like Oma, worked in the hospital kitchen. On down the row was Ellie Kusarova, a Czechoslovakian girl with an effervescent personality, complemented by a beautiful singing voice. She was a cheerful, positive person and much appreciated by the patients in the hospital where she worked. As I came to know Ellie better, I realized that beneath this happy exterior was a person with a deep, very deep hurt. Ellie was adept at appearing carefree and lively, but underneath the surface I had seen a very grieved spirit. She was a devout Roman Catholic, and we had many opportunities to talk together about God. Ellie shared with me the source of the hurt and allowed me to pray for her. Beneath Ellie was a German girl named Katie Eckstein, for whom I felt an immediate affinity. We were about the same age. She had come from Germany to live with her sister, who was married to a Dutch patrol officer. Katie and Ellie became close friends. I felt joy to be available whenever either of them needed to unburden themselves to someone. In a measure, God enabled me to bring help and comfort to them on a spiritual level. Not only was Katie physically beautiful, but she had an inward charm and grace. She was always a willing helper and a clever, creative seamstress. So naturally, she was assigned to the sewing room, making uniforms for the Japanese and work clothes for us women. The section next to Katie and Ellie was occupied by Mrs. Vanderhorst and her 4 daughters. Shortly before the Japanese invasion, the Vanderhorsts' oldest daughter, Lynch suffered a mental collapse. The doctors could find no reason for this sudden personality change. Seemingly overnight, a beautiful, cheerful, outgoing girl became depressed and withdrawn, except for occasional, unpredictable fits of temper. Lynch had grown obese and had become exceedingly strong. The whole family was under a pall of disbelief that this had happened to their beloved Lynch. These Dutch names are hard to say. I have a notification. Get rid of that. Mother showed me a picture of Lynch before the collapse. She had truly been a lithe young woman with a flawless complexion, natural light blonde hair, and dark blue eyes. In a few months' time, she had totally regressed. Though quiet most of the time when she was enraged, only Mrs. Vanderhorst could handle her. One night, a terrifying scream rent the barracks, and we ran to where the Vanderhorsts lived to find Lynch trying to choke her mother. It took her sisters and a number of us to force them apart. More than once she had made attempts on Mrs. Vanderhorst's life, once trying to stab her with a knife. How often I saw the mother standing with the picture grieving for her Lynch, and how often I heard her say, "If it wasn't for God, I don't know what I would do." She loved the Lord and drew upon him for help and comfort. What a great wound this family had sustained, a hurt only God could heal. The next daughter, Tina, was a physically strong, very dear girl with red hair. She worked at the piggery. Mine, the 3rd daughter, was very tall and very lovely, with blonde hair. She worked with the garden crew. The youngest daughter, Katrina, was spoiled naturally, but she was only 13. They were girls to be proud of, and they brought much comfort to the mother. This family was respected by all of us, and we sorrowed for them and Lynch. During a severe outbreak of dysentery, Lynch took ill and died in the camp hospital. The family could but say it was a blessing, since the doctors held out no hope of Lynch recovering from her mental illness. Next to the Vanderhorsts came the section of the barracks where Miss Seeley, Mrs. Presswood, Miss Kemp, and I lived. Mrs. Jaffrey and Margaret lived in Barrack 6, where Mrs. Jaffrey had many friends from Macassar. However, they later moved to one of the cement houses, which was better for Mrs. Jaffrey, as it was less damp and not as cold at night. Basically, this was the arrangement that existed at the end of the war. very large go-down had been constructed in front of our block of barracks. Here were stored all the camp supplies. The rainy season came with a promise that we would be sloshing around in a sea of red mud until the dry season came again. The grass roof became waterlogged. The bamboo frame was not sufficiently braced to withstand the wind and driving rain. One afternoon we heard a crackling sound, followed by a mighty swoosh, then crash. A cry went up on all sides for everyone to get out and help salvage the food. The whole camp worked for hours trying to save as much as possible. Ruth and I were given a rigid bamboo stretcher on which to carry between us heavy copra bags full of saturated rice and sugar. Oh, copra. I looked that up before. Copra. I looked it up and now I can't remember what it was. Heavy copra bags. I called on the Lord for strength, for I was sure my arms must come out of their sockets. My spine felt as though the vertebrae were being crushed one into the other. When everything was stashed under cover elsewhere, we limped back to the barracks. Our feet hurt from slipping and sliding around in the mud. Every muscle in our body screamed with fatigue. I made up my mind that if I were going to be a coolie, I'd have to brush up on the shifting the load technique. The well was down on the other side of the camp, beyond the cement houses. We had to carry a bucket and rope for drawing the water, and by the time we had walked back to the shed in mud or dust, we needed another bath. The well house was much too small to accommodate all those who had to use it. It was a day of rejoicing when we saw workmen arriving to begin sinking wells in the areas between the barracks. At first, the water was red from the clay, as the wells were not lined, but even this water was welcome for washing down the toilets. During the dry season, water became scarce, and we were careful of every drop. During the rainy season, we could wash a considerable amount of mud and dust from our work clothes and legs by just standing in the rain. A bathhouse was constructed around the well site, and a cement guard wall was put in around the mouth of the well to keep the children from falling into it. With soap, as with food, clothes, everything, sometimes there was just enough. Other times the supply was far from adequate, and if it were in short supply, we bathed with our clothes on to conserve the soap, for that precious item soaked through the dirty, sweat-filled garments and cleansed our skin as well. We had 2 sets of clothes issued to us. Shorts and sleeveless blouses for those of us under 30. A dress would be requested by those over 30. These garments were navy blue, but after the first wash they were less than navy blue, and after being in the sun for too many days they became gray. Because there were no lamps in the bathhouses, we bathed by braille, then put on our dry outfits for sleeping and were ready for work the following day. About 2 weeks after we had arrived from Molino, Mr. Yamaji was assigned to Kempili as permanent camp commander. Our isolation was so intense that very little of the outside world slipped across the moat and under the barbed wire perimeter of our 2-acre compound, but occasionally a rumor reached us. It was whispered that Mr. Yamaji had a maniacal temper and had just beaten to death an inmate of the men's camp at Peri Peri. We were dying for news of our own husbands, and those women who had sons also interned up the coast had double concern. But if the rumor were true, the new commander was certainly not the man to ask for that cherished information. We could only guess how our husbands must have felt, how helpless, how thwarted, how anguished, when they learned that this man was being transferred to Campili as sole authority and arbiter over the lives of their wives and children. One morning the camp was called to assemble before Campili headquarters office to meet Commander Yamaji, a short fat man with bow legs. He paced back and forth before those lines of women and children and a few remaining men. His face was round and moon-like, and his dark eyes watched from behind large, dark-rimmed glasses. His black hair was crew-cut, short and spiky. When he issued commands, his parted lips revealed tobacco-stained teeth. He was dressed in a lightweight khaki uniform, short pants with knee socks, and a singlet under his lightweight shirt. We were to learn that when his temper was aroused, he was like a man who had gone berserk. He could be deathly ruthless. The second in command to Yamaji was an impudent young officer who bore the ill will of all. He strutted about and loved to remind us that we were his slaves. He often made an issue out of nothing. He was wholeheartedly abhorred. Beneath these two men, Mrs. Joustra continued to serve as the link in the chain of command between the women and children in the camp and their Japanese captors. She was 38, large and angular, with skin that seemed to be permanently sunburned. She was gifted with unusual organizational abilities. She wore glasses with light plastic frames, and her hair was braided and wound around her head. Her work attire was a pair of shorts, pedal-pusher length, and a pair of heavy boots that amazingly lasted throughout the entire war years. She was a schoolteacher by profession, a fine woman who took her responsibilities seriously. As best she could, she juggled the insistent work quotas of the camp commander and the decreasing morale and physical condition of the women for whom she felt great responsibility. Our days had been so busy since our arrival at Campili that there had been little time to visit with Dr. Jaffrey. I went over with Margaret every week to cut his hair and trim his beard and mustache, but I missed the visits and the Bible studies. One early evening in July, after I had finished my barbering, we had quite a lengthy chat. Dr. Jaffrey loved people and had been relating anecdotes about those in his house on the other side of the camp. As Margaret and I rose from the bench to leave, he said, "Lassie, I love Mother and Muggy, but I'm so lonely for Russell." 2 days later, the big trucks rolled into camp, and all the men, with the exception of a carpenter and Dr. Marseille, and the boys over 16 were ordered to collect their baggage and board the trucks for deportation to Peri Peri. Dr. Jaffrey was to get his wish. He would be with Russell. From our barracks, Wang, Mine, Fu, Jan de Kaiser, and Robbie Paul were to be taken. They hurried to say goodbye to Dr. Jaffrey. We hurried to say goodbye to Dr. Jaffrey. He looked so regal with his white hair and close-cut beard and mustache. I felt like crying. Must he also be taken away? That day we said farewell to a prophet, a great man of God, and a dear friend, and we all knew it. After they had loaded the men into the truck, Dr. Jaffrey leaned toward me and said, "Lassie, whatever you do, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ." The echo of those words was to sustain me through the awful days ahead. Yikes, I'm worried about how bad things are going to get. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. And we're going to finish reading that right there. But here are some photos in the beginning, in the middle of the book. So this is a picture of Darlene and Russell in Brussels, Belgium, holding church meetings during a weekend break in their language study in Holland. And this is a picture of Darlene as a young bride and a new missionary. This is the cover picture. the one there with them in Brussels. And the cover picture. And this is Darlene McIntosh and Russell Deibler on August 18, 1937, their wedding day in Boone, Iowa. And then this is Deibler's official work portrait permit, the Deibler's official work permit portrait in 1938. There's the wedding picture. And then there is the picture of them as their work permit picture. And then this is Dr. Robert Alexander Jaffrey arriving in Macassar on the day Darlene first met him in 1938. And then at the bottom here, a copy of the drawing of Russell's grave by Brother Geraldus, given to Darlene by Ernie Presswood after the war. This copy was drawn from the original by Bruce Rose, Darlene's son. Okay, so this is a photo of, or a drawing of a grave, Russell's grave. That's too bad. And we know that she said that she never saw him again, but we still don't know the what happened exactly. Here is a picture of crossing one of the precarious vine bridges constructed by the Dyaks. And this is a picture of Darlene leaving the coast in a canoe traveling toward base camp. That seems so long ago now, right? I think that's what they're talking about, the base camp. This is a picture of Russell with 4 young friends on the steps of the home he and the Dyaks built for Darlene. And this is a chieftain of the Zonganaus from Zapena bring their gift, a pig, to welcome the white women from the spirit world. I remember that happening. And meeting the first Kapalkus near Anaratali. Oh, we saw that picture. And there's the gift of the pig. And then there's the other one. This is a picture of Darlene surrounded by the Kapalku women as they greet her, the first white woman they had ever seen. Right here. And Darlene in her first home with Russell. The walls were woven by the Kapalkus. Oh wow, I hope you can see this. Darlene carried the few decorations in her pack over the treacherous trail to Anaratali. Can you see the weaving? It's pretty cool. And then this is one of the camping sites along the arduous trail from Oita to Anaratali. It's hard to see that one. And here's another one of Darlene holding fresh greens, a gift from Idantori and his youngest wife. If you can see that. And then this is Campili after the Allied bombing on July 17th, 1945. These are all from the bombing, after the bombing. Which we haven't gotten to yet. And one more page of pictures. And this a picture of the missionaries 2 months after their liberation. Despite the hearty post-war meals, Lillian Marsh, Margaret Jaffray, Ernie Presswood, Ruth Presswood, and Philomena Seeley remained severely under their pre-war weight. And this picture of Darlene Deibler 10 months after returning to the States. Her health remained precarious for years to come. She definitely, so that's afterwards, after her release. You can see the toll it took. I'm not sure, looking quickly, I'm not sure how much time took place in between that because we haven't gotten that far yet. But, so I hope you enjoyed those pictures. It was a little challenging to show them to you, but let's say our bedtime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Guide me gently through the night and wake me with the morning light. Amen. I hope you sleep well, and we'll see you tomorrow.